I'm going to record this so that we can share it with those who couldn't make it today. I've also had a number of people who were excited to attend, but have not been able to just for scheduling reasons. So this is the first one that we're going to do, and then we'll probably end up doing another one next month, probably later in October as well. So the focus of today's call is going to be talking about economic incentives with the state of Arizona and also some tax credit opportunities. And this is for both companies who are new to Arizona, who are moving here, and for those who are already established. Many of the companies who are joining us today have already been established in Arizona. And Arizona is unique in that the governor has taken a very big stance, which David can get into in a moment, on maintaining and keeping these companies here locally. So we can get into why that's important for the state of Arizona and the approach that they've been taking. So I hope everyone can see my screen. Gary, can you see my screen?
Yes,
Perfect.
Thank you, Ashley.
Okay, so today I'll just be moderating, and if people have questions, please use the chat feature. David Hickey is going to be the main presenter today. He is one of the managing directors at Hickey and Associates. They're headquartered in New York City. They're a global firm, and we're a proud partner of Cresa. I'll let him get into a little bit more about Hickey. We also have the executive chairman of Cresa Global, Gary Gregg, who will be joining us as well. And so he'll be able to give an overview of Cresa briefly, and then talk about the relationship with Hickey, and also the importance of having companies recognize that it's not just a lease transaction, but there's other things that should be involved and considered whenever they're looking at their real estate needs or portfolio needs, either in Arizona or otherwise. So Gary, I'm going to let you jump right in and talk about Cresa a little bit.
Thanks, Ashley. I'll just take just a minute. This isn't about Cresa, it's about the Arizona incentives and labor piece. But I'll just do a quick overview for those of you who don't know. I know we've got a couple of clients on, longtime clients, so you are aware of who we are. But Cresa is a commercial real estate brokerage advisory firm. We're 100% tenant oriented, and with the tenant's point of view, we don't represent landlords or developers. We have 1,100 employees in North America, 50 plus locations. And we did a little over 3,500 transactions in 2020. So the bulk of that is going to be leasing, a handful of consulting projects, which we're going to talk about here a little bit today, project management, lease administration. We've got almost 10,000 leases under our lease administration platform. We offered technology, portfolio visualization, transaction tracking, project management tracking. Capital markets is a service line that we spend a lot of time on, and have spent a lot of time in the last 2 years, specifically with clients that are trying to monetize assets in this environment, with valuations climbing. Portfolio solutions we'll touch on just for a minute on the next slide, where we help companies that have anywhere from 15 to 600 or 700 locations in the US and globally. And then incentives negotiations and labor analytics. Those two we partner with Hickey on. We've been partners with Hickey for in common clients for 20 years, but Cresa has collapsed our internal group about 2 years ago and created an exclusive partnership with Hickey, who we believe is the best in the world. And we're very excited about this partnership. It's been formalized in the last year, and I think we've got over 100 transactions working together with the Hickey team. Dash, want to flip slides?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Oh, this is the Hickey overview.
Yeah.
Dave, you want to hit this?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And thank you, Ashley. Great to see everyone on here, and a number of very familiar faces and some of those clients as well. So Hickey Associates, we are a global firm, largest independent firm that does what we do, and that's site selection, location strategy. I've been doing this since the mid 80s. That can mean a lot of different things. Ultimately, it's working together with our partners, with our clients, to find what is that most optimal location for them to do business, whether that's an industrial project, a warehouse, logistics, down to even on the retail side. One of those key elements, and a couple that we'll talk about today, are on the incentives. And that is trying to find, navigate, identify, and ultimately capture those different incentive programs from the federal, the state, the provincial, the county, the local, the utilities, all of the above across the board, and then also on the labor analytics. So help defining what is that sustainable workforce, availability, supply, quality, and then down to the costs, of course, as making that into the full-on business model. We'll certainly talk about that a little bit more later.
That's great. Thanks.
Great, and I'll just touch on a sampling of our clients. These are our clients joint with Hickey and Cresa clients, Arizona focused clients, North America, and then global as well. Many of these clients have been clients for 20 years and continue to be clients. We manage everything from single locations to their global portfolios. And like I said, the relationship with Hickey is firmed up towards exclusive over only the last year, but a lot of these clients have been joint clients for over 20 years. So the relationship is very deep and strong.
And I think one more thing to add, Gary, is that this is a great list, and they're very large companies that all of us are pretty much aware of. The focus today is going to be on Arizona. And some of these, and most of the companies that are on the call might just have one or single location. So the portfolio might seem a little bit large or too much for them to be considering at this point, or thinking that they're going to be too small for us or Hickey to address their needs. However, we have a case study with each one of the different incentives and tax programs that show that not only do you have a large company, but you can have smaller incentives as well that still have a meaningful impact on the overall business. One more thing I can add is that if you do have a question, please send me a chat, which I've gotten a couple already. And then also, if you would like to interrupt, please do so.
Thanks, Ashley.
David?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. And I think an important piece there to comment on and to build on is a lot of times when folks, when companies, when businesses, when partners look at incentives, they think it's just for those mega deals, those large projects that are coming in, that are expanding, that are big in the news and the press. Well, those certainly are there, and you hear about those on what seems like a daily basis. The majority of incentives actually go to those businesses that are creating jobs, that are investing capital, and that are really building and developing in locations that have been identified, targeted by the various states and communities and the like. As mentioned earlier, Arizona is certainly one of those states that do have incentives, and incentives that are directly targeting those companies that are creating jobs. We'll talk about it in a minute, quality jobs as defined by the legislature, and then also making capital investment. And that capital investment is very wide ranging, is relatively flexible compared to other states. And what is very interesting is also allows a look back, even things that may have already been done and investments that have been made. But before we get into some of those specific programs, what are those triggers, as we call them, for incentives today? Again, as mentioned, so capital investments, and that can be anything from major equipment in a manufacturing facility down to furniture, even into some of the transactions, the development costs. We'll talk about that. Human capital. That is really the creating jobs, investing in your workforce, and training, looking at those job training opportunities. Anytime that you are creating a job, there is opportunity for incentives. There are different thresholds that need to be hit depending on where you are, what wages you're paying, what size of that workforce it is. But anytime you're doing that, it's always important to look at incentives. And in many places, including certain parts of Arizona, even looking at retaining jobs as part of that decision. Because sometimes when we're in that acquisitions and real estate phases, sometimes it's an expiring lease, it's a lease renewal that is coming up that might be that trigger for incentive and that opportunity. But certainly as building through and working through that process and through that real estate strategy, there are ways to identify and capture incentives along that to help not only the wider portfolio, but down to the transaction level. And then energy and sustainability is one that we talk about more and more every day. And those are investments that might be in energy efficiency, even in lighting, that can be significant rebates, easily 50% returns on some of those, and maybe some of those that you're making anyways. But to be able to look at what are some of those ways that you can partner with government entities, other stakeholders, and the utilities as well. And I mentioned the utilities because that is certainly an untapped resource from an economic development incentive perspective by most businesses today. That can be support with it, whether it's an efficiency upgrade, it's transmission, it's connectivity, site development, infrastructure investments, but also just on the rates that you pay and the ability to negotiate those based on more of an economic development perspective and incentives than in some of the other ways that traditionally look at it. When we look at larger projects, a good rule of thumb for us is somewhere in that 30 to 32, 35% range in those savings that we brought back. Much of that on the capital investment side, 5 to 20%, depending on that size and scope of the project and the type of the investment and industry. And then also on the labor side, so a 1 to 5%. And that can be captured on some of the tax credits we'll talk about, and as well as even on some of the training side. When we look at training and job employment, it could be 50% of the wages returned and reimbursed when training activities are in place. And it can be pretty wide ranging and flexible what those types of training activities might be. And in the state of Arizona, there are really, we'll talk about 4 kind of major programs today that most businesses should be evaluating, should be looking into, and really can be differentiators when considering the state of Arizona and developing and growing and or continuing an investment. One of those that is probably the headliner as we look at it is called the Quality Jobs Tax Credit. What is important, and something that Ashley noted earlier, is that it's not just about entering or making a massive expansion in the future. Even looking back today for existing companies in the state of Arizona to capture, and even projects that may already be going on. And the reason why I'm saying that and why that's a differentiator is most of the time incentive programs require a but-for or something into the future that commit to that incentive before you make that investment, before you make that real estate, execute on that lease or create those jobs. This program actually allows you to look back 12 months from a certain point in time of, say it's today, of 12 months back to help qualify and actually capture credits for those jobs that you created for that investment that was made. This program, Quality Jobs, is certainly tied to that job creation element and as well as into that capital investment. Just to in brief, basically, if you create 25 new jobs and you're in Maricopa or Pima County, you're really in more of the urban centers, you pay a median county wage, which is somewhere between 30 in the mid to upper 30s, and you invest $5 million into qualified expenditures over a 12-month period, you can capture $9,000 per job for those jobs that you've created. There's really not necessarily a larger cap to how many you can qualify for, but as long as you hit those points within 12 months, you can capture these programs. The tax credit is non-refundable, so you need to have some kind of tax liability and or a premium tax that you can use this against, but it can be very robust. The list of those expenditures that can be utilized, it's pretty wide ranging and flexible in what those spaces are. A great actual change to the program in the last couple of years, because some may say, well, I'm going to create 50 jobs, but I'm not going to hit that $5 million investment. Well, the state and listening and being able to mobilize and modify it, actually the higher the wages that you pay, the less that investment threshold is. We had a number of projects that came in that we're not going to hit a $5 million, let alone a $2 million investment, but they may be creating several hundred jobs as they're entering into that new, especially into a Class A office space. But when you pay those more wages, that reduction goes down. So at that $5 million point, if you're actually paying twice the average wages, which is about in the mid 70,000 per job, your investment only needs to be $500,000 during that period. So it's definitely allowing for that flexibility. Just a couple of quick case studies and examples of this project in action, this program in action. Life sciences pharmaceutical client, some shipping and distribution, but really a lot of customer service type operations, creating 175 jobs, all at about a range of $40,000 to $45,000 an hour. And CapEx was $8 million, but pretty mean in over that 12-month period, much of that TI driven. They were able to secure over $2 million for that project through this program and being able to utilize this and capturing that over the jobs that they created over the initial 3 years for that. On a smaller project front in Tempe, just off of Mill Avenue, company created 45 jobs, pretty medium to higher skilled tech roles. And with that, just a relatively small investment of $3 million. But because they were paying a bit higher, they were paying around mid 50s, lower 60s average wages, they were able to capture the program. Not a significant overall and a mega deal, but still over $400,000 as part of that investment and part of that for a tax credit that they could use over the coming years.
Hey, David, I do have one question. It says, if I have already established if we have already signed a lease in the past 12 months, or I'm anticipating signing one in the next 12 months, does that apply towards CapEx?
It does. So there is a strategic approach that needs to be taken of when you set that baseline date. But as long as you can do and show the investment or when that lease was executed, the job creation and hitting those capital investment within a 12-month period, and in that 12-month window, you can qualify for this program. There are certainly ways that you can maximize it and maximize that value opportunity, as well as minimize any potential risk going forward of that job count you take and the way you can build that out. There are different ways to look at that and to apply it, but certainly should be eligible and should certainly be evaluating the program.
Thank you.
So a very similar program, but does have some major differentiators, is called the Qualified Facilities Tax Credit. Also allows some of that if the investment or some of the commitments have already been in place. But what this does, and one of the major differentiators, is it's called a refundable tax credit. So those not as familiar with it, on the previous program, in order to utilize the incentive, you have to have tax liability. Under a refundable program like this one, you don't necessarily have to. So if you don't have that tax liability yet you have earned this incentive, then you can receive this more in the form of like a cash grant per se during the life of that incentive, which is typically over a 5-year program, 5-year timeline. There are significant opportunities for it. Right now, the award is based on the lesser of, it's either 10% of the investment, 20,000 per new net job, and they're actually in the works right now of modifying that, increasing that level to 30,000 per net new job, or 30 million per year, whatever the lesser that is. There are not necessarily job creation ties as strict as the previous program of 25 in the urban or 5 in the rural. But what it does is it requires an investment of over 250,000. So again, this is relatively easy to meet. There also has to be at least 80% of that in manufacturing, R&D, or as a corporate headquarters locally. A few of the examples of where this has been extremely successful. Project we did recently for a building materials business down in the West Valley in Tolleson, created 50 jobs. So some of the evaluation, especially on the non-refundability of the previous program, would make it more of a challenge. So instead of going for quality jobs, looked at the qualified facilities. And with this, for those 50 jobs, we're able to capture approximately 850,000 for this program. No, there are other incentives that they're also pursuing and capturing as part of that, but under this program alone, we're able to capture that, which ultimately helped push this program or this project over the edge through this program. Another one for a large aerospace client in Glendale, as they were looking in a pretty mega project in the sense of the size of the investment, but not necessarily on the jobs. 225 jobs, it's not a small project, but not necessarily mega compared to some of those other announcements you've heard recently in Phoenix, but still we're able to secure 3.5 million, ultimately almost 4 million for that project by utilizing this tax credit program. And while they have Nexus and a lot of their sales and their income are in other states, they're able to receive this by using this program in a refundable manner. And again, through a more of a cash grant type of direction.
David, another question I have is, can these two tax credits do they have to be singular, or can they be combined in terms of the tax credits that you would receive both from the facilities and from the quality jobs?
So typically in the past, we have gone in not combined for a single project. But what we do and looking at strategically is perhaps they are different projects. So the ways that we might be looking at the investment, we might be looking at the job creation, is actually taking some strategic direction to that and approach, and how this can be best be leveraged, how it can best be maximized over time. And then, what is that also that capture period that's best for the company? And so more of a parallel path, if anything, as opposed to necessarily combining the two. But it's a great question, and certainly something to be evaluated through the initial phases of the incentives process.
Another question I have received is, what's the process that I need to, what information do I need to provide in order to start this process? And just to answer that, we'll get to that towards the end in terms of what the next steps are.
Now, the state of Arizona does have a discretionary grant program. Many, when especially foreign businesses, as they are investing in FDI into the U.S., often look for the governor's deal closing fund, made famous about 10 years ago by former Governor Rick Perry of Texas, where he was entering California and offering and having almost an open checkbook. The state of Arizona does have what is known as a deal closing fund called Arizona Competes. It is not a program that is used often, but it is one to certainly help drive high impact competitive projects to the state of Arizona. In 2020, they had about 7 of these projects that were utilized, that utilized this program, but it's certainly something to evaluate, especially as there is a competitive nature. Now, in those 2 previous projects, does not require the typical competitive element that other state incentives do outside of Arizona, which also makes them major differentiators. This one does require that amount and that level to it. So there are some caveats to it. There's an economic analysis that's required by a third party. There's some auditing as well be in place. But really, the key elements to it, you must pay over 100% of the county median wage, which again, in many cases is depending on the county, somewhere between the upper 30s to the mid 40s per job on average, and then provide a greater than 65% of the health benefits. From there, there's an open to discretion in working with the governor and working with the state commerce authority. A few examples of these in recently, and one thing that's different than the other 2 programs is on that retention and honoring the retention side of those jobs and those projects. So one, a major insurance provider in the Southeast Valley in Chandler, creating 2,500 new jobs. And part of this commitment is actually to retain, making competitive and at risk 900 or so existing jobs. The CapEx for the project and part of the development that's in it was over $26 million. In conjunction with some of the other programs we've mentioned, they were able to secure $1 million in this cash grant. And it's not something that necessarily the governor of Texas and other states may be offering up, but it's certainly something to help close the deal and help meet that delta. And with a strategic, negotiated, competitive approach. Another one for a major hospitality group that moved from the East Coast to Scottsdale, just outside the 101. They created, in not a massive, but about 250 jobs. For that, retained roughly 100 that were already here in the Valley. CapEx altogether as part of the development and the fit out of about $25 million. They were able to secure through this a discretionary cash grant for $500,000. Again, in conjunction and parallel with the other programs, but just through this as well in this kind of deal closing fund.
I have 2 questions that just came in. One is, assuming this is for both office and industrial users.
Great question. It is for both. Yep, it is used. Now, certainly on the office side, there has to be shown a greater impact, a greater number of jobs that will have to be a part of it. But certainly if there's a development side to it, if there's any kind of new construction or major fit out of an existing facility, existing office building, and then on the industrial side, the capital investment must be significant and really show to be a differentiator for the Valley. And you can imagine what some of those industries are, just that we've been hearing more and more about, such as semiconductors, is one of those that are certainly being targeted with this program.
And then the office and industrial also applies to the tax credits.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. Great question.
Another one is this only for a headquarters or regional headquarters, or for single locations as part of a portfolio or as a second location?
It can be for all. It can be for all of the above. Certainly part of it is building that narrative and the case for why it deserves, why it has this delta and it needs the additional support and that high impact. But certainly all of the above and the different assets and uses can be as part of the portfolio, or again that single site. Certainly under this program.
Good questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, what we've touched on so far is from the state, whether it's from the governor and down through the Arizona Commerce Authority, but there are also local support mechanisms that can be available throughout the state, some of that at the county and as well as at the municipal level as well. This varies greatly depending on where you are considering, where you're evaluating the timing of the project and certainly the size, scope, and industry of that project. One of those that comes with a bit of controversy in the state, but is applicable and can be relatively lucrative is the gross property lease excise tax, known as GPLET, which is basically the state's form of a property tax abatement. That is available. It's up to 8%, 8 years of 100% of the property tax abatements that are done, and is on a discretionary basis at the city level. Those can be utilized for existing buildings, and then as well as new development that would be ultimately leased by the community, leased by the government entity, and then leased back to the company and under an excise tax as opposed to the property tax abatement. The differentiator here from a lot of other states is that it is set forth that it needs to show an economic development basis, and it is based on that incremental revenue that would come in based on the abatement that would be applied. It can be incredibly valuable, and again, it requires a strategic approach, and it varies what those different discretionary terms are and requirements based on the city, based on the community that you're looking and working at. But there are other communities that have, alongside this program, and in addition to it, other incentives, including sales tax rebates. Tucson, for example, is one that has a number of different programs that they can leverage. They have zones that they've identified to really focus on and to build out, but other programs as well that can be utilized. And again, sales tax rebates, which can be pretty significant when looking at a project and a program. A couple examples, these in Tempe for a large transportation corporate business, adding about 750 new jobs for a regional headquarters project altogether. And in the development side of it was over $35 million. The incentives that were secured through these local incentives were just shy of about $5.5 million altogether. Some of that through property tax abatements, and as well as some of these rebates on sales taxes and other construction expenses. In Tucson, a recent project from an electrical engineering firm, 35 jobs, $5 million investment, not a significant mega project by any means, but certainly one that required some additional investment and support, and overall incentive secured from the local level. This is again on top of what was received by the state. It was about $415,000 in the forms of abatements and rebates as well.
Okay, can you make a quick clarification? When you say incentives secured over the past 4 slides, is that specific to that slide, or is it specific to all of the tax incentives or credits that they've received?
That is a great question. So the incentives secured here are focused on the program that we're speaking on specifically. So overall, they all would have been eligible for the quality jobs and qualified facilities programs, and then as well as for the state and to the local. I can say that the 2 that were on the Arizona Competes were the only ones of these that received that program and grant under that, but they were all eligible as well for quality and qualified facilities.
Specific to this municipality slide, do all states provide this?
So all states have incentives across the board, and they all have various economic development policies, the way they approach it, the way they fund them, the way that they work. There are certainly differentiators across those. Arizona's and their differentiators are, there are programs that don't necessarily require that same competitive leverage as other states do. And then also that look back opportunity. So even looking back, even though if you may have made a commitment or started a project along the way. But it is important to understand what it is across those boards. In the US, each year is somewhere between 50 and $60 billion that are leveraged as part of incentives. And in many ways that we've already discussed here today. Also important to note that there are, and something we don't go in depth here today, there's also another $360 billion that are being funneled down through the federal government today, much as the American Rescue Plan, the previous stimulus bill, and as well as the CARES Act, that is sending dollars to the states, the counties, the communities, down to the local cities, that can be utilized for economic development purposes, especially on the infrastructure and workforce development side.
Thank you. And then do cities negotiate against one another specific to the slide here, the municipality opportunities?
They certainly will. They will do that. Sometimes not in a public forum, but those opportunities of leveraging. So we talk about a lot of times in incentives is state versus state, but definitely as you come into the communities and if you have that competitive space, especially between say a Tucson and Phoenix, you will definitely see some competition there that will come through the incentives. And one certainly has stronger incentive programs that they can use, but there's other different discretion that can be leveraged as well.
Great, thank you. Great questions, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we added labor analytics, I think is going to be an important one to talk about. And then just as an FYI, we've had a lot of people reach out and ask about the labor. We have these incentives, but now we can't find the labor. So we touched on this right now, but like I'd mentioned before, we're going to look at potentially doing a more deep dive study into the labor analytics, both in Arizona and elsewhere as for other companies. But I'm gonna let David jump in from here, please.
Yeah, thank you. So we are in as dynamic a workforce environment as we've ever had in our country's history. We were already in a critical point going into the pandemic as far as the challenge and the war for talent. Coming into the pandemic, we certainly had some major shifts. We saw unemployment skyrocket at levels never seen before, especially at a pace and without a return as immediate as many had expected. But now that we come out of the pandemic, it is going to be even harder than it was before. We have quit rates that have reached record levels. We have still unemployment level, yet at the same time, we have the highest job application posted right now. Some of that is impacting particular industries such as hospitality, restaurants, bars, and others, but we're seeing it across the board, even in manufacturing today. There are some highlights. There are some positive signs though, as we keep going forward. And one of those is certainly in Phoenix. There, as we looked at the job losses, which were incredible in the millions and millions, even hundreds of thousands in single markets alone, what we haven't necessarily saw is all that great growth back, especially in positive during the pandemic. Phoenix was one of those. And as you can see here on the map of MSAs, not just major markets, but MSAs across the country, metropolitan areas, you can see Phoenix is double what the next closest in growth is so far. Much of that growth we've seen actually in college towns, as opposed in some of that natural growth and sustainability, not as much in larger markets, but you can see Phoenix is continuing to see that. And that is across a number of different industries. And we're even seeing, which is particularly exciting, on the office side as well. You know, we're certainly seeing a lot of that manufacturing, industrial, data centers, logistical growth, but also back into the office market that many did not predict we would see quite yet. But we are seeing that in Phoenix and some of the other Western markets as well.
Thanks.
And what we also saw was a great migratory shift, you know, and it happened very quickly. In some ways, not as drastic as many may have estimated at the beginning, and assuming a place like New York or LA or Chicago, San Francisco, where you did see a diaspora very quickly in the hundreds of thousands that left. Now, not everyone left and relocated across the country or you know, to a completely different region, but certainly left some of those urban centers. We're slowly seeing some of the return in some of those markets, but not everywhere. There are some, what you're seeing here is some of that migratory in and out during the 2020. The biggest thing to highlight is in Phoenix. So in Phoenix, you can see that purple. You can see that growth was continuing going into the pandemic, has continued through the pandemic, and is expected to only grow and be more exciting coming out of it. But you can also see some of the other major markets. You're seeing Dallas, Houston as well with some of that growth period. I think one of the very interesting anecdotes in here is actually in South Florida. Many people thought, well, everyone was moving to South Florida from New York and all this big growth. South Florida actually has less people today living there than there were before the pandemic. And much of that is from reduced immigration, especially from parts of Latin America and Europe, where typically there's a normal out migration that comes from the South Florida, particularly in the Miami area. But that is usually replaced through immigration. And without immigration, without a lot of these individuals that were entering the US, South Florida actually has less people than today, and other COVID impacts, of course, across the wider environment. But what you have seen, which is incredibly exciting in markets like Phoenix, where we had that growth coming in, and that growth has only continued and more robustly than even before. And especially those types of workers that many of you on this call today are looking for and need into the future, or is that type of talent and that workforce that is moving to Arizona.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the process to begin.
Yeah, so how to begin, how to kick off the process. So the first thing to do is to pull together what you are doing today, what you're going to do in the near term, and as well as into the long term, and really start building out that strategy and aligning the opportunity for incentives within that strategy. That everything else, all the other business, the real estate, the operational factors that you're looking at, the financial modeling, and putting that in place with what incentives might be there. Incentives won't drive the project's ultimate location, won't be the main factor, but it should be part of that consideration. And even again, some of those investments that have already started in Arizona might be eligible for that. So these are just a few of those steps along the way that should be put in place. That questionnaire of capturing that data on the front end. We'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of moments. Building out a dashboard. What is it that's possible? When is it possible? When will these incentives be received? What are the types of incentives? How will that be booked against the business for the business liabilities, cash grants, and the like? Really the details out of what those incentives are, how to capture them, what clawbacks might be there if unable to meet certain commitments or economics change, things along the way. And then really being able to define that. And as a matter of time and how that fits into the business schedule and the operational schedule, and as well as along with aligning with that real estate and those real estate decision processes. And when is that lease execution? When is that purchase agreement? When is the renewal going to be in place? And aligning that all together with that incentive strategy.
Here's a question. With this information and this outline, can I go directly to the state or city or municipality and negotiate directly with them?
You can, but we typically advise to take a step back first, because in order to maximize the opportunity and as well as minimize any kind of that risk to what that commitment might be in the near and long term, it's to really develop a strategic approach to the process. And that aligns well, sometimes it may seem straightforward. It certainly isn't. And for some of these programs in the state of Arizona, as we've looked at, we'll talk a little bit about the compliance side, but once you've even secured and filled out the application and worked through the negotiation and signed off on it, there is a compliance period, and that element of reporting what you've done in order to capture and receive. And there's a lot of nuances that come into place, and understanding those elements and building that into the strategy as you go forward. And then also there are different phases, there are different changes that might come along the way, and helping to hedge either against those that might happen or be unforeseeable, and also to be able to capture additional value if there is further growth. Being able to run different incentive programs and how they all work together is very unique and bespoke to each project and should be approached that way. So we recommend really taking back and building out that strategy in that negotiation before approaching the state, before approaching the communities when discussing incentives. And we also, there's an important element for public disclosure protection and amenity, and not just on the incentive side, but on the real estate side, on other business fronts, that should be key in part of this process from the outset until ready to make that announcement going forward. So as part of that process to really get started, what some of that information and some of those things to look at and to understand. So one is evaluating what are those current hiring and investment plans they have going forward, even recent growth and capital investment spend. Then really building out understanding. So what are those opportunities that are there from these various programs that we spoke about today, as well as others, and how could they work best for the business? As we mentioned, two of those quality jobs and qualified facilities, a project could easily qualify for both of those, but which might be the right path, or what would be that right path strategically, and how to do that in developing that strategic book forward, as well as the team and the partners to help do that in the best appropriate direction, and who are those stakeholders to engage, when to engage, why to engage, and across the board. And then also, as mentioned before, establishing those compliance programs. I know a couple quick clients here on the call today where we do work through that process. So once those incentives have been received and the project is underway, those different reporting and protocols in order to ensure that those dollars are received into the long run. And I know many times companies are hesitant about the overall burden that this process might bring, and really need to understand it doesn't have to be overly burdensome. And we help to bring that and to reduce that strain on the business, because many don't have resources internally to necessarily do this. Just a few of the high level data points that we need to get started would be, what are those facilities? What are those different types of jobs that you're hiring today, the existing, really even just a brief worksheet of what those might look like and what those hiring plans are, what some of those wages are. And we don't need it defined necessarily by role, but overall average, what is that? What are some of those benefits being paid? Looking at the capital investment that needs to be there, some utility, not necessarily on the full power. And of course, depending on what the type of asset in the industry is, any R&D spending that might be in place. If you do have tax liability historical, whether it's in Arizona, whatever that jurisdiction might be, but particularly for the Arizona programs, what your historical elements there, or anything that's estimated, any existing incentives that you have. Because if you have existing incentives, it doesn't mean you can't pursue new ones, or you can't even renegotiate or build on those existing ones that you have today. Any training, workforce elements, helping build out what that narrative is for that project, using, like, if it's not a corporate headquarters, a center of excellence to help build out what that is and what that means. And then of course, on the real estate, and doing this in parallel with that real estate process, across all the options being considered, the location, the site, the size, the use, and being able to align all of that in a collaborative strategic approach.
Okay. You just mentioned if we already have historical tax incentives, what is the time period by which I can go back and renegotiate?
It all depends. There is necessarily not a set time period. It depends on the programs, depends on the projects that you have in place. And oftentimes, instead of necessarily opening incentives or trying to renegotiate in Arizona, we may just sign new. It's a new project. Perhaps it's the same location, but perhaps a new project, and understand what is that kind of baseline that you're at right now, that in a job basis and investment in that facility, your lease, your purchase, whatever that might be, and then building from there. So it could be opening, renegotiating. It may just building and adding on top of that. And again, approaching that with a strategical direction and considerations for that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Yeah, these have all been really good questions. I'm going to pause right here, see if there's any other ones that come up. I think I've hit all of them that have been asked. So one of the things that I might add is that our value proposition is to be an extension of you. What can we provide that can even just be on the front end of giving you information? So David and Gary and myself can help with finding the right resources for you. Whether you engage us or not, we want to be able to provide you information so that you can go back to your businesses, your corporate teams, and say this might be an opportunity for you. So my responsibility is to, if you can reach out to me first, what I can do is put the right team around you. Is it reaching out to David for labor or incentives and for him to make an extension of his team? Is it for Gary and our team here locally to put together some sort of real estate plan that can be coming in conjunction with labor analytics? Or so whatever it is that you might have questions on, please reach out to me and I'll make sure to put the right team around you as we move forward. But if there are any other questions that I don't see, thank you so much for your time. And we'll look forward to speaking and hearing from you.
Thank you all for joining. Thanks, David. Thanks, Ashley. Great job.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.